We'll go ahead and officially start the recording. We'll go over the weekly question here in just a minute. Gentle reminder that using specific examples from the textbook is a good idea. I'd prefer you weren't using online sources instead of the textbook. You could do stuff in addition, but honestly, um, answers from the textbook is really what I'm looking for. Don't feel like you have to go beyond that. I know it's easier to look stuff up online, but part of the reason I prefer you use the textbook is we know it's a reliable source, which matters a lot in a history class. Okay. Um, I thought I let the person in. Okay, let's look at the weekly question. Weekly question. It's a lot of weekly questions. Here we go. During the 1960s, oh gosh, when you look at the list of weekly questions, we're so close to the end of class. How did that happen? During the 1960s, the United States became a more open, more tolerant, any word free or country. Defend or refute this statement. And this one's a little tricky because honestly, the whole chapter kind of, helps you answer this. But if you look, let's see, wrong chapter, sorry. Yeah, pretty much the whole chapter. What I would do to structure this is I would start off with a discussion of just kind of a basic intro to the 1960s. And then I would have a paragraph about things that I thought made the 60s more tolerant. And then I would probably have a paragraph where I talked about things that I thought showed that the 60s really wasn't making progress on tolerance. And then, excuse me, at the end, tell me what your conclusion was. Was it more tolerant overall? Was, we're on the right track, but not quite there? Really just on the surface more tolerant, but behind the scenes not really that great, or just completely no? So usually on these questions, you don't want to go with, yeah, completely tolerant, or nope, it was crap. So something in the middle, and that I'm looking for specific examples. So if you want to talk about the economy, the book has statistics about the economy. You've already mentioned most families own a car, or average income increases, or that sort of thing. Um, if you talk about civil rights, mention some events. Talk about who seems to be included in civil rights and who seems to be left out, and how maybe the more nonviolent part of the civil rights movement is giving way to the more impatient part of the civil rights movement. Or, there are lots of different things that you could discuss, and the textbook's full of specific examples. Your answer needs to have some. Now, I know what's tricky about this one is you could literally list any specific thing mentioned in the chapter. So you just have to choose them. When I was grading stuff that was turned in late last night or yesterday or sometime recently. And I know that I can't remember who it was, and I wouldn't want to say in front of the whole class anyway, but I was grading somebody's argument that I thought was really one-sided. And I just wanted to say, if I ever argue the other side, it's not really that I'm trying to tell you that your position is wrong or that I disagree with you. Because I thought about that after I wrote it, and I thought, oh, that poor person's going to think she's kind of a jerk and she disagrees with me. I was really trying to make an impression that even though you believe one side of an argument, which you should, I mean, we all have to take a position. So not suggesting you should never have a strong belief. It's most of us do. Don't ignore the other side of the argument, at least acknowledge it. So I think if you do the paragraph about stuff that seemed to be more free, and then the paragraph about stuff that seemed to be less free, then that's, your opportunity to acknowledge both sides of the argument. So kind of what I'm going for there. And, if you were that person whose paper I graded and it seemed overly harsh, apologies, certainly was not my goal. So apologies if it came off that way. Yeah, I'm pretty sure a lot of times when you think of me as a professor, your first thought is overly harsh. So, no, every once in a while I'd have a high school kid parents call and say that they were intimidated by me. And it's like, yeah, enormous problem. Kids are often intimidated. All right, before we get started, is there anything you would like to ask? Or you want to make just a general statement? Talk about the weather. I was watching the press conference about adding more seats to the Supreme Court, which I think is fascinating. And we sort of vaguely covered the Supreme Court reform plan. And I was, the current events are always a nice chance to reflect on history, right? And it's from this unit. So is it from this unit? World War II is in this unit. Supreme Court reform plan, in some ways, FDR said, oh my gosh, they declared parts of the New Deal unconstitutional. That's crap. I don't like it. These guys are old. They're out of touch. They don't, suit the common opinion, that sort of stuff. Oh, I didn't tell you page numbers for the question, but we'll try to work on that as we go through. And yeah, I'll look at that in a second for you. But with the Supreme Court reform plan that FDR initiated, he thought that his own personal popularity might carry it through. And it failed pretty miserably on the surface. It didn't pass and people thought he was trying to grab too much power. But some people think that the Supreme Court got the message because they didn't declare any more of his laws unconstitutional. So as I was texting my dad about this morning, because yes, unfortunately, in my real life, I'm every bit as boring as I am during class. I was telling my dad, this could just be an intimidation factor sort of thing. Maybe it's not that he really wants to reform the Supreme Court. Maybe he's trying to send them a message, he being Biden. But those guys in the conference, I think the press conference, I think they really did want to reform the Supreme Court. Yep. No, I definitely did not say any page numbers. You guys were not fascinated about my discussion of the Supreme Court reform plan? My point there was really that it is possible that FDR's strategy may not have been really to reform the Supreme Court. It was just to remind them, that he was more popular than them and, they better watch their step. And they didn't declare any more of his stuff unconstitutional. So you never know. As far as page numbers, oh my goodness. Okay. So you've got the civil rights section of the chapter, which is, you guys really? Uh-oh. Apparently my messages would go to everyone in the waiting room. Okay, that's really weird because there's no one in the waiting room. So civil rights, these are pages, let's see, we're chapter 25, right? So it's the first couple of pages. So it's 985 to, because you're going to pick and choose what it is you want to talk about, right? So 985 to 990. And then there's going to be more civil rights toward the end. You guys know these chapters have those lovely subject headings, that kind of thing, right? Goodness. I think there's more. Yeah, you've got sort of 1019 to probably toward the end, right? 1025. Yeah, and this chapter ends with that whole discussion of 1968, which might be the most depressing year ever. I always tell my little brother, Jeff, that the only good thing that came out of 1968 was Jeff. Yeah, so if you're looking for foreign policy, and if you're wondering how does foreign policy reflect freedom, openness, that kind of stuff, you could think of it as safety, I suppose. But also when we start drafting the crap out of people for Vietnam, you probably feel less free once you get drafted. Ah, dang. Can I edit this? Yeah, I can do whatever I want, right? Okay, there's more civil rights stuff. I didn't mean to. No. I'm gonna mess this up, aren't I? This is your fault. You asked for this. You see how I blame you? I'm worse than a student, aren't I? Okay, so 993 to, how could I leave out the civil rights part of Kennedy and LBJ? That's crazy. Okay, so foreign policy, 990 to 993, and then you guys could do this yourselves, you know, right? Yeah, I mean, you could divide it into civil rights, foreign policy, and domestic policy. That'd probably be a good way to go about it. This chapter really is kind of segmented, isn't it? And then you've got the Vietnam section starting on 1005. Students Democratic Society. Yeah, and I know we've got to cover some of this stuff, so I won't do this for very long. And then you'll have more of a domestic policy, personal freedom sort of stuff. And then I won't do this after, yeah, I'm almost done. So domestic policy, probably power, war on poverty. The war on poverty, that's that economic section you guys probably were thinking about talking about too. I think I would think of the domestic policy kind of stuff more about economics and law, that sort of stuff. Plus, you've got a lot of really important Supreme Court cases that we'll talk about here in a sec. Got the Voting Rights Act too, which is kind of interesting. Really interesting, actually. 996 and 999 to a while. 1001. And then, yeah, after this, I'm done. And we're talking about the notes. Port Huron statement, that's kind of interesting. All right, and then personal freedom. God, that's kind of tied in with women's rights, though. So court cases, I would stick the court cases in here, which is more about personal freedom as well. And then I would kind of look at the end of the chapter as well to kind of wrap it up, to show you, like, does it look like we're about to have more rights or fewer rights? It could. To court cases, and I know it says freedom. Sarna. Related to court cases and the 1968 election and other events. 68's a crappy year. You'll see that here in a second. Okay. All right. That's all I got right there, even though the spacing isn't exactly what I intended. So. So for the weekly question, perhaps. So intro about the early 60s. This is what I would do. You don't have to do it this way. And then I would do paragraph about how things were more free paragraph about how things were less free. Poop. And then I think I would conclude and mention UGG. Oh, the 60s end. If it looks like things are going to get better or worse. Okay, that would be my plan. Now, I know I always tell you, like, you don't have to do it the way that I would. You do have to use specific examples. So I know I don't want you to think, well, you said you don't have to do what I ask. I said, you know, you don't have to do what I ask you to do. You do have to put in specific examples, okay? All right, kids, specific enough. um, I, yeah. All right, that's the best I can do for you. But it's really because the chapter's so full of stuff. I really think your problem is not going to be finding examples. I think your examples or your problem is going to be deciding what examples to put in. And I'll try really hard when I'm grading not to say like, I really think you should have used this example or that one. I won't do that. You've got like 8 million things that you could put in there. All right. For some reason, I have no memory of our class on Tuesday. Let me think about this for a second. I think it's because I just don't feel good today. So we talked about, okay, we did talk about that. We talked about Bay of Pigs. I remember this now. Kennedy was a little weak on civil rights. I might have mentioned that. Did I tell you that he made deals with the Southern governors to desegregate colleges? Like he made a deal to desegregate University of Alabama. You saw it in the what is that movie? Forrest Gump, where the girl drops her notebook and Forrest Gump picks it up. And then you've got Governor Wallace. I couldn't think of his name. I was going to go with Faubus, but that's Arkansas. So Wallace from Georgia, who's blocking the door and you know, trying to make sure the soldiers don't desegregate. But they made, oh, sorry, I did not mean to do that. So they made a deal with him that he would get to make a stand like that. But in making that stand, he also agreed that he wouldn't allow really violent things to happen because when they desegregated the University of Mississippi, they had sent in the National Guard and stuff got blown up. And that was so one dude, James Meredith, could get in. And, you know, lots of discussion in that era, particularly like by Malcolm X and guys, like, why in the world are we working so hard to get into places where people don't want us? So, all right. I have no idea what you guys are talking about in the chat. So sorry. So Kennedy, civil rights. And then LBJ, I know we talked a little about how he was the anti-JFK. He'd also grown up relatively poor, so that made things a little different. Okay, here's some laws you could easily talk about in the weekly question. Civil Rights Act of 64, Voting Rights Act. Oh yeah, we looked at the Daisy ad. Immigration Act in 65. These things are going to bring big changes in the Great Society. The promise of the Great Society was to end poverty, and ending poverty brings all kinds of freedom. I mean, I know, well, I don't know, you know, we live in a fairly affluent area. I know where I grew up, it's really poor. I grew up in the Ozarks of Southwest Missouri, Joplin, Missouri. You got to be tough if you're from there, because if you're not, you can't outrun the tornadoes. But you know, people told us like, it doesn't matter how much money you have as long as you're happy. It's because everybody was broke there. You know, here when I taught public high school, everybody said cool stuff like, yeah, I'm going to be a millionaire someday. And like, you know, I don't know how many people you guys think are millionaires, but all my high school students were just convinced they were all going to be wealthy, and they tended to be more conservative than I expected high school students to be. No offense at all, high school students from the school that I used to teach at. And I thought, well, that was kind of odd. Um, but the idea that money doesn't buy happiness, money doesn't buy happiness, but it sure pays the rent and it makes sure you have dinner. And dinner is really good. People like to have dinner. And no, I'm glad glad you guys are getting vaccines if you want, not trying to be controversial at all. Yeah. All right. Oh, goodness. That was a big discussion when I went to visit my relatives who tend to be a little to the right of center. We'll go with that. I tend to hang out in the center, I think, but you probably think I'm conservative, but well, I don't know what you think. It doesn't matter. But the Great Society, getting rid of poverty, puts everybody on an equal footing. I was thinking about a friend of mine who lives in Brazil, and he and his girlfriend just had a baby, and the baby's like super, super sick. So the baby came a week early, the baby's a week old or a month early. Baby's been in the hospital for a week. And that here would make you really, really broke. I mean, no matter how much uh, insurance you had, you're going to end up paying a big chunk of money at the end of that. And, you shouldn't have to worry about, can I actually afford to take care of my medical needs? And this Medicare thing that you're going to see, and expansion Medicare and creation of Medicaid, really kind of a thought to address the high cost or the lack of medical care. And I know we have the Affordable Care Act, and maybe things are a little better than they used to be. Although I know occasionally, I have medical expenses and I look at them and think, how do people pay for this stuff? So economic freedom is, you can't really overlook that either. All right, back to talking about the laws. Voting Rights Act of 65 makes voter registration federal rather than state obligation. Of course, we're revisiting some of this even as we speak. But that's because local areas sometimes would close voter registration offices at certain times, or they had different rules that you had to follow if you were white or black, that sort of thing. It was really easy for states and local governments to exclude certain voters. And it wasn't, I know the big discussion right now is about ID, but that wasn't what was going on at all back in those days. I mean, they would literally, like, if there's a big line of African Americans deciding they wanted to vote, then the voter registrar would just close for a week, just really randomly. Or they might have, like Rosa Parks had to take a literacy test, and they also get rid of literacy tests in this time period, but she had to take a literacy test. She was a college graduate, completely literate, which she failed, I think, 3 times until she took a lawyer who observed while they graded it. And the literacy test, white people were exempt from it. And whoever graded the literacy test, I remember listening to, I think it was Amelia Boynton, who's civil rights activist, and you can see her in the march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge at Selma. I mean, you can see video of her. She was saying that sometimes, you would go to take that literacy test, and the person who graded your test had an 8th grade education, and they had no idea if you answered things correctly or not. But it didn't matter, because a lot of times they just threw your application away. So nationalizing voter registration, or at least the requirements for voter registration, hugely important in that era when Southern states really directly discriminated. And I know the argument now is that Southern states don't discriminate anymore, and that's part of why you saw the All-Star game get moved to Colorado from Georgia. I don't know, all that stuff, and I don't want to start political discussions, but it comes from that discussion comes from a real problem from the 1965 era, the 60s and before. I'm not suggesting it's not a real problem now. That's sort of up to you. It would be hard to deny that making Black people take a test that white people didn't have to take wasn't racist. That would be hard to deny. But don't do it. Immigration reform in 65 changes. Forever we'd had a lot of those quotas and things from the 1920s when we decided we didn't like immigrants so much, except Mexicans, whom we loved. But we didn't like off and on. I know some of you are going, really? Off and on. When the economy is good, we love Mexican immigrants. When the economy is a little stinky, it's like, hey, go home. But in the 60s, we still had those quotas that essentially banned all Chinese immigration. Remember, the Chinese Exclusion Act really still in effect during this time period. And some of you are going like, no, I know Chinese people came here. Yes, they did, but they went to Canada first and then came to the United States because at that point they were Canadian immigrants, not Chinese immigrants. So immigration reform ends immigration based on national origin quotas and opens up immigration in a large way from Latin America, Caribbean, and Asia. And by Latin America, I mean, I know Mexico is really Latin America, but we had substantial immigration from Mexico off and on throughout the 20th century. So letting people in from all different backgrounds, you might see that as more free. A great society, at this point, we had fewer people in poverty than probably any time we'd actually been able to measure poverty. So the thought was, economies roll in, let's go ahead and make that final push and just eliminate poverty. So that's really what this plan is supposed to do. So they're going to add things that you would think of, well, maybe not your generation, what my generation and older would call welfare. Because I don't know, when you listen to the old relatives, like, well, those people are on welfare. Well, aren't we all to some extent every time we use a road or something like that? But the idea of welfare is that the government is subsidizing some part of your life to make it a little better. And in this instance, it's going to be a direct plan that probably doesn't have the same access to everyone. So, you know, I mentioned roads. I know everyone gets to use the road. So I'm not suggesting that. But Head Start was a program for kids younger than 6. Back in those days, you didn't have to go to kindergarten. But younger than 6 to get them more ready for school. The thought was that kids who were poor or whose families did not speak English as a first language didn't enter school quite as ready to learn in English as other kids did. And if you're wondering, what does poverty have to do with it? Are you wondering? Poor people don't have as many books. As a rule, I'm not saying poor people are not allowed to buy books. I'm not saying that. But, you know, as a rule, you don't have the extra income, so you don't buy that kind of stuff. Also, I know when I was a kid 8 million years ago, my parents worked a lot because they had bad jobs. They're not listening, so I can say this. And there were times when I was in high school, both my parents typically worked about 80 hours a week. And so they didn't know who any of my teachers were. There wasn't going to be a parent conference. There were no parent phone calls. It's a little early for email. Yeah, it was a little early for email. It's the 80s. So my parents were 100% uninvolved in my education, probably from about 8th grade on. And it wasn't that they didn't care, it was that they just had to work ridiculous number of hours to barely make a living for the nice family they created with 4 kids. I know you're going to say, they have to have 4 kids. No, they like this. Don't be like but if you're poorer, which we were kind of on that edge of poorer, your parents also don't have as much time to help you, because typically, I think there's a stereotype, maybe not with you, but certainly in the last school district that I taught in, that people who are poor because they're lazy and they don't work that much. If you have an hourly job or 2 or 3 hourly jobs, especially if you're a single parent, you're probably working so much you don't even have time to sleep. So it's not that parents are uninterested or that they aren't working hard. It's just they're just not making enough money. So these plans are supposed to help the parents that are probably working hard but not making enough money. So Head Start gets the kids a little head start to be more ready for school, and also maybe takes a little bit of daycare off the table for some folks, so that makes their lives a little cheaper. Job Corps, that's for you. If you didn't quite make it through high school, it can help you get your GED or some trade, you know, so you can become a plumber, or oh, what else can you become? A mechanic, that sort of thing. Carpenter. There's lots of great skills that they would teach you. I had a niece that did this to become a chef. So, you know, cool stuff like that. Medicare expansion and creation of Medicaid. So Medicare is the health care for older people. So that's the one you get when you start Social Security, or if you're 65, I guess you don't have to be on Social Security to be eligible for it. Medicaid would be health care for people that are just poor and younger than 65 and can't afford health care. So that way you don't have to just skip the doctor because you broke. Food stamps and commodities, this is food. So back in the day, they had like little books of stamps that they would give you, and you could go use those at the grocery store. Those are not the same if you have really old relatives that talk about stamps the grocery store would give you. That way you could save them and get like a free towel or a pot and a pan or something like that. But these are stamps that the government would give you, and they were worth a certain amount of money, and then you could spend that at the store. They still have Aid to Family Independent Children, AFDC, but that's usually like a debit card now. And part of the reason they changed that is because stamps are really obvious, and sometimes people were too embarrassed to use the stamp. So the card just looks like how everybody else pays for their groceries. Commodities are, and they still do this in some places. I don't know if they do this in the Austin area, but it's like a government sponsored food bank kind of. And if you qualified for it because your income was a certain level, you could go there and you would get eggs and milk and butter and cheese. I don't know if they had meat or anything. I do know, this on good authority, I may actually know this for sure, that whatever cheese they used to give out was really good for grilled cheese. I'm just saying. But this really helped people to get more food, that kind of stuff. And then people also on the other end of the political spectrum, we still had some people who felt the way that folks felt in the 20s and 30s about government assistance, that it makes you lazy and dependent, that maybe people take advantage of the system. And, there's probably all sorts of truth all around the spectrum. I think it really is very helpful to some people, and most people use it as designed. I think there probably are some people that take advantage of it, because there's always somebody doing something stupid, right? Rich, poor, whatever race or ethnicity, male, female, there's always a stupid person, right? Anything you might think of as welfare is kind of what shows up in the Great Society. And the plan is to end poverty. Sometimes it's referred to as the war on poverty. Okay. Malcolm X, a Northern civil rights guy, you've probably heard about him. I need to find, I can't remember if I put it in the document section, but some links to some videos from Malcolm X. I think because we're in the South, we don't know Malcolm X quite as well. If you've watched the movie Malcolm X, it's pretty accurate about what Malcolm X's life was like. It's really long though. I think it's Spike Lee. It's really old. It came out when I first started teaching, so it was 90s, early 90s. But pretty accurate. Also Denzel Washington, everybody likes him. But Malcolm X was a really smart dude who grew up in Michigan, and his dad gets killed by the KKK. But they do it in a way where his dad was a pretty well-off insurance salesman, and they had a really nice house in a white neighborhood. But that was really irritating to the local KKK. And Malcolm X's dad was a Marcus Garvey follower, so he's kind of the early Black is beautiful kind of dude. So they lived in a pretty prominent in a nice suburb, in a big house. And I think there were like 4 or 5 kids, and the wife stayed home, that kind of thing. They tied Malcolm X's dad, his name was Malcolm Little, to a railroad track. They kidnapped him, tied him to a railroad track in the middle of the night. And of course, when they found him in the morning, he was not alive and not in one piece. And the police declared that his death was a suicide. And the reason they did that is because, he's an insurance salesman, he's got life insurance. So if your death is by suicide, your life insurance doesn't pay off. So his family became destitute. The mom went to an institution. All the kids went to foster care. And Malcolm X lived in a fairly rural area, all white school, but he was like the smartest kid in his class and got the best grades. And then when they went from 8th grade to, high school, his counselor asked him what he wanted to be, and he said he wanted to be a lawyer. And he goes, "No, you're Black, you need to be a carpenter," or something like that. And that's about the time he says, "School's maybe not my path," and goes off and does some kind of rowdy things. ends up in jail for a while. He and his best friend get involved in some bad activities, drug use, this sort of stuff. And they end up robbing some people's houses with their girlfriends. When they end up getting caught, the girlfriends get probation, and Malcolm X and his friend go to jail for like 10 years. If you're wondering why the girlfriends got probation, some of you are going like sexism, possibly. Yeah, some depends on the crime. Sometimes women do get lower sentences, but it's also because the girlfriends are white and the guys are black. Chicago is where they committed their crimes. He converts to Islam and becomes, when he comes out of prison, he really becomes incredibly self-educated. All he does is read and study and that sort of stuff in prison. Brilliant guy, brilliant speaker. Anytime you can find a video of him, just look on YouTube and listen to him speak for about 5 minutes. You're like, dang, that dude is smart. He can out argue pretty much anybody. He becomes the spokesperson for the Nation of Islam, and then eventually he does a pilgrimage to Mecca where he leaves the Nation of Islam, which is a unique Black Muslim group within the United States that also has some unusual political beliefs. And so he leaves that for greater Islam and then gets honestly killed by people from the Nation of Islam. So life is short and eventful and impactful for Malcolm X, and he makes a huge difference in the civil rights movement in the North. He's much more of a Northern guy. He also calls Martin Luther King Jr. some names, which he'll apologize for later, and says he's really an accommodationist, that sort of thing. But yeah, it's really interesting if you have free time to study that. I know you guys are full of free time right now. All right, ton of stuff in the book about even more things that I'm talking about right now. Oh, I was worried it was time for the 3-minute warning, but not even close, is it? Aren't you excited? I could talk some more. Yeah, I know you are. Oh, I needed the water, didn't I? All right. So civil rights in the early period, you start to see a little action from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and you'll see some pushback from them about the Southern Martin Luther King Jr. led part of the civil rights movement not being aggressive or assertive enough. They'll also, I think this section will talk about the rise of the Black Panthers, which is really interesting movement. They've got this weird combination of stuff going on, like they do after school programs and school lunch programs and school breakfast programs before schools did that. But they also have a plan to declare war on the police. And their thought is, let's shoot the police before they shoot us. So, you know, it's a mixed bag when you look at the Black Panthers. You look at some of their programs and go like, very needed. They're part of the reason that you end up with more Black history programs or Black history studies. And I'm not saying that I know G. Carter Woodson, Black History Week. I know about all this stuff because I'm the history teacher. But their push for more ethnic studies programs really does make a difference in the 60s and 70s. So there's some good things that come out of the Black Panthers. But the whole declaring war on the police and literally assassinating police officers that maybe just were patrolling areas. And I also understand, I know that this is news right now, police brutality and George Floyd, and there's a trial, and some other stuff's happened this week. So I know that this isn't over in any sense of the meat of the measure. But if you look at statistics in this era, and if you look at, there'll be cities in 68 where there are riots and they are literally sending tanks in and militarized police. And I know that does still happen some, but this is a whole different level. It really is. You can look at video and look at statistics from the time period. So while I don't know anyone who thinks, it's okay to assassinate police officers who are on patrol, their thought is eventually that police officer is going to kill someone in our neighborhood. And I'm not even suggesting that statistically they were correct. I am suggesting that more people got hurt by the police during this time period, and especially in primarily Black neighborhoods in urban areas. So Statistics will back that up. And I know that statistics don't tell the whole story. I know this, I do, but they do tell part of the story. So, and it really wouldn't be hard to find some video from that era of peaceful protesters where the police just got tired of them and shot them with water cannons or sick dogs on them. So yeah, if you would ever try to argue that police brutality wasn't present in the 60s, you would have no success at that. You just wouldn't. Okay. All right, let's talk about Vietnam. That'll cheer us up. No. All right, so Gulf of Tonkin resolution happens during the election season for LBJ 64. And I was listening, I can't even remember who it was, some Republican commentator, more conservative person saying, maybe it was Newt Gingrich or something, that dude is conservative, talking about how the biggest mistake in foreign policy in that era, or the biggest misleading perhaps among people in the toward people in the United States may have been Gulf of Tonkin resolution. But what you see in Gulf of Tonkin is the president asking for really unlimited use of force in Vietnam from the Congress, which he's going to receive. And he's going to suggest that without this blank check of support, we can spend whatever we want without a continuing resolution, that our soldiers are in danger and communism is going to come over to the United States. And that was exaggerated at best, is kind of the conclusion that we've come to. Now, as we start to send advisors and get more involved in the Vietnam conflict before Gulf of Tonkin, most people in the United States are not necessarily distressed about this, but you start to see student groups especially protest Vietnam, and really you've got Students for Democratic Society who are starting to think that our system of government really isn't representing the average person well, and that it really just represents the establishment, whether it's the military-industrial complex or wealthy people in general. Now, when we decide to send more troops after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, oh, sorry, I'm messing up the screen, the American public is probably okay with this, because this idea of stopping communism overseas before it comes to the United States, we're fine with that, because it's the Cold War, we're afraid of communism, evil, godless communism. The thought for LBJ was he did not want to be the president who lost the Vietnam conflict. So he wanted to increase his use of force, kind of get it done, get it over with. And there's some extreme miscalculations as we conduct the Vietnam conflict. Now, we'll talk more about Vietnam in the next chapter a little, because I'm going to feel like we slighted Vietnam, and I realize that it's not as much a part of the next chapter. The conclusion of the Vietnam War is in the next section, but we get a lot of military people, and I think the head of General Motors, some other people to be advisors on the Vietnam conflict. I know it makes sense to have military people advise, but they had a lot of business people advise as well. And all of those people were likely involved in producing things that would lead to profit for them during the war. And this is going to fit with, I know one of you is going, I just argued that about World War II. And I really wasn't trying to say that your argument was wrong. It wasn't. I was just concerned that you were overlooking something else. In the Vietnam conflict, that argument works even better. I mean, it just does, because if you look at who's advising and who's making some of the decisions, but I also know people who fought in the Vietnam conflict who would say, the problem with the Vietnam conflict is we made political decisions, not military decisions, about prosecution of the war. And from their perspective, I see that. I'm talking about my uncles who fought in Vietnam. And also I had a fellowship where I got to study at Georgetown University for a summer. And the head of our fellowship was also the head of oh, what branch of the military was he the head of? The Coast Guard. But he had fought in Vietnam, and I got to sit next to him on a pretty long bus ride to the Supreme Court, and he was explaining to me what he thought went wrong in the Vietnam conflict. And he definitely was on the we made political decisions rather than military decisions because, on the surface, an army like the US Army could have gone in and completely possessed North and South Vietnam and, made them do whatever we wanted. Um, North Vietnam borders China. So there's that issue as well. And I know China is not the strongest country in the world in that era. I know that they rank a little higher now. But the geopolitical issues were kind of interesting. And our goal wasn't necessarily to win the war. It was more, and winning the war was protecting South Vietnam, not necessarily controlling North Vietnam. And oh, it's complicated. People would argue we followed different rules than the communists did, which might be true and might not. But then you also have that very basic, if you go back to the why the heck are we there? Why the heck are we there? I mean, did the presence of US troops and coalition troops in the South and Chinese and Soviet troops in the North bring a great benefit to the nation of Vietnam, or did we just kill millions of people and destroy stuff? And this is not even to argue that the leadership in North Vietnam wasn't horrific and repressive. But here's a weird thing. The people that we aligned ourselves with in South Vietnam asked us for permission to kill their leader in a coup, and we gave it because they didn't want to lose our military support, financial support. So they said, hey, are you guys okay with us killing our president? And we said, yeah, go right ahead. Because he was incredibly repressive to Buddhists. I don't know who in the world, one, would repress any Buddhist because, they're like the Quakers of the world. They're nonviolent, pacifist kind of folks. And two, why are you repressing Buddhism in Vietnam? It's the weirdest thing. And that's also where you see that really famous protest picture with the monks self-immolating, setting themselves on fire to protest their country's leadership. Yeah, I don't know, man, what a mess. But anyway, the Vietnam conflict stuff, definitely in your book, starting on 1005. But we get in with the larger resolution of force with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And because LBJ doesn't want to be the president who loses the Vietnam conflict, he will dramatically escalate the use of force and the number of troops and practice a policy called Americanization. So, oh gosh, allergies, so sorry. So Americanization is the idea that we will fight the war and win the war in Vietnam using American forces and American materiel, American war stuff. So American troops, American materiel. So we'll increase the numbers to 500,000 at a time. Certainly millions of people served in Vietnam. And they may do multiple tours. I had an uncle, one of my very favorite uncles, Heinz Hardy. He may have not been from the United States. He's a German immigrant from Nazi Germany. So, he got out and then came over here and thought the United States was absolutely the greatest country ever in the history of the world. And you could never argue anything different to him. And I would never try because he's a serious war veteran, career military dude. And yeah, it's just not worth the argument at all. But Uncle Heinz was a radio operator, and he got dropped behind enemy lines and told them where to drop when they were going to do bombing raids. He gave them the area or the location where to drop the bombs, and he literally loved that job and talked about it honestly a little too much for me as a kid because it's a little rough. But Uncle Heinz served 4 terms of service, and he did 4 tours of service in Vietnam. But on his service record, it says he only did 3. And the reason that it says that is one of his tours was in Cambodia. Now, if you look at the map on page 1005, you'll notice that Cambodia and Laos they border North and South Vietnam, Laos north and Cambodia toward the south. And what my uncle was doing was calling in bombing raids for supply and troop lines for the North Vietnamese and the Chinese communists who ran their supply lines and troop lines outside the country, which violated UN protocol. But, again, who follows orders during a war or rules during a war? And because my uncle was fighting in a place where we technically weren't, he didn't get service credit for it. And if you're wondering, like, does service credit really matter? It does. It increases your pay and your retirement, that sort of thing. But my uncle never, ever bitter about that. For him, it was just an honor to get to serve his country. So I think what you see in my uncle's story is all the stuff that was really kind of wrong or right or wrong with the Vietnam conflict, because you have people who really want to patriotically serve their country and are doing what they think is right, and they want to protect people. So you have people with very noble intentions, like my Uncle Hein. I know, I just said he enjoyed calling in bombing raids, which he did, but certainly a noble guy who went with noble intentions and didn't want to see anything like Hitler rise in somebody else's country. And he went for the best of reasons. And also, what you see in my Uncle Heinz is poorer people who volunteer for the military because that's kind of who volunteers for the military. And that's also who gets drafted, because wealthier people find ways to get out of the draft. Like your current president or your recent past president. So, I think both Trump and Biden, I know that both Trump and Biden got draft exemption because their families were connected, or I don't know that Biden's family was as connected. Probably. But anyway, but poorer people, they didn't get exemptions and honestly probably went to serve willingly. So you've got poor people, really patriotic guys who go, they want to serve their country. And if you read that book, what is it? The Something Before Morning, the Linda Van Deventer book about her experiences in Vietnam, that's who she is. She was patriotic, stopped the communists, that kind of stuff. And then her story is that she's in the medical services, and what she sees really changes her mind about the Vietnam conflict. My uncle's mind was never changed. He was with that admiral who said, we just didn't fight it the right way. We should have gone in full force and gotten it over with. But you also see, people who probably making money off the conflict by producing material for the war. You see politicians who don't want to lose a conflict because they don't want to look weak on communism. And you see spokespeople who say that we're winning the war when we're not. So there's all kinds of mess that goes wrong in Vietnam. And you could easily argue that we didn't prosecute the war in a way that would cause us to win the war, even though you could also argue we had no business being there at all. Uncle served in Vietnam as a cook. Yeah, and you would think too that's a relatively safe job, but no, not all the time, for sure. No, the Vietnam thing's super controversial, for sure. And at the beginning of the war, the country tended to be in favor of it. 68 is really the turning point, and we'll talk more about that in the next chapter. But that's when we start to figure out that maybe, yeah, there you go, getting stopped. Not cool. Sorry for your uncle. We find out in 68 that maybe we're not being told the truth. And that as time goes along, we're finding out that this war just may not be a winnable war. And we may not have, the people in Vietnam who are fighting because they got drafted. They don't want to fight either. And they're not nearly as involved in the communist versus nationalist struggle. They're mostly a bunch of small farmers that would love to farm instead of get blown up and get drafted so that they have to go attack people when they'd rather be home farming. So it's messy, but it's not to say there aren't legitimate political interest in that country. There are, but the average person isn't a part of that. And the average person is really harmed by this war. Well, 68, lots of stuff happens. Martin Luther King Jr. gets assassinated. Robert Kennedy is running for president. LBJ has said that he is not going to run for re-election, in part because he thinks that he's prosecuted the Vietnam War very poorly, and he's really kind of grieved by it. And you could also argue he just knows he can't win. If you look at speeches and photos and stuff from the time period, you can see that he's probably troubled, but some of you are going, yeah, he should be troubled. He was. So he decides not to serve the second term. The Democrats nominate a pro-war fellow, Hubert Humphrey, who was LBJ's vice president. The anti-war Democrats have a fit. And this is after Robert Kennedy, the main anti-war leader, was assassinated during his campaign. He's actually giving a speech to thank his campaign workers after he wins the primary in California, and he gets shot on camera by a guy named Sirhan Sirhan, who's a Palestinian who thinks that the Kennedys would be too favorable to Israel. So, we can add some more political intrigue in there. General chaos ensues between pro and anti-war Democrats. And if you watch video of the Democratic National Convention, they have riot police outside, and they literally come into the convention and they're beating people, and reporters are getting beaten as well. So their convention is incredibly chaotic. And then you have George Wallace running again, the segregation now, segregation forever guy on the Democrat side. So there's a really good chance the Democrats aren't winning this election. And there's protests all throughout the country. We've got those 2 major assassinations. So dang, except for Jeff being born, my little brother, this year. This is a crappy year. And Nixon comes back. Remember Nixon? He had lost in 60, said you won't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore, went back to California, ran for governor and lost. And then it's like, man, I'm out of politics. But he sees an opportunity here. And he gains the Republican nomination by saying he would restore law and order to the United States and end the war in Vietnam. The same way that Eisenhower had run and said, look, I'll go there and take care of this. And whether we thought Nixon can do it or not, I was 2, so I really didn't have many thoughts about Nixon at that point, and Shirley wasn't voting. But whether we thought Nixon could do this or not, that's definitely what we wanted to hear, because we had general chaos throughout the country. We got a big mess. And it probably felt the way sometimes, our country has felt maybe in the last 6 months with a lot of chaos and that sort of thing. And people are like, we'll just do whatever it takes to get rid of the chaos. Nixon had experience. He didn't really seem crazy. I wasn't suggesting that he is crazy. But he's had some political experience. He's managed foreign policy before. He's a little more conservative, a little more law and order focused. And we just think, you know what, maybe that'll take care of things. In the meantime, some other stuff's going on. Okay, and I know I've got like 15 minutes left, so I gotta hurry. Although we can do this in 15. Although I'm gonna stop for a second and drink water. Okay, Feminine Mystique. Oh my gosh. You could read this for your book review. You could. Feminine Mystique is written by a woman named Betty Friedan, and I had a grandmother who was very much a women's lib feminist kind of woman. And when I was about 12, she was concerned that my mother was too conservative. My mother was very conservative. And that I went to a cult-like church. Oh boy, I don't know if my church was cult-like. I definitely don't go to the same type anymore. It was really conservative. We'll go with that. So she told me I had to read The Feminine Mystique. So I'm 12, and there's nothing more exciting to 12-year-old than reading a book about feminism that their grandmother made them read, who's kind of a weird hippie that bought a fire engine and didn't always wear clothing at the appropriate time. So I had a very unusual grandmother. So I read The Feminine Mystique, and here's what I remember about it. Because, I'm 12, but I have a decent reading level and probably more interested in politics than the average 12-year-old, but I'm still 12. So I read this book, and the thing that I remember a lot is the discussion of the problem that has no name. And while I didn't completely identify with that as a 12-year-old, As I got older, it made more and more sense. And I'll explain to you what the problem that has no name is. It's that women, once they become wives and mothers, wives or mothers, but both, and the assumption in that time period, because we're still really conservative, is that you get married young, you start having kids, that sort of stuff. And you're somebody's wife, you're somebody's mother, that you lose your individual identity. And this is so true during this time period, especially middle of the country, that when you got married, you took your husband, not just his last name, but his first name. So, like my mother, whose name was Cindy, she was not Cindy Sowers, which was my dad's last name and my maiden name. She was um, Mrs. James Sowers. So she didn't even really get to keep her first name. So you weren't, your first name and your husband's last name, you were Mrs. your husband's name. And then, the most important thing you could do is raise kids. And I am not denying that raising kids isn't, an amazing, worthwhile, hugely important, impactful. It's a great thing. It is. It is. Um, but if your whole identity is who's your husband, who are your kids, you sort of lose track of your individuality. So the push in the feminine mystique was, be a wife and mother if you like, but also keep who you are. Go by your first name. Maybe keep your last name and not your husband's last name. Maybe keep your career. Maybe, try daycare for the kids rather than being the stay-at-home mom. And you could still be a good mom, even though daycare. Now, I know it, well, I don't know what some of you are thinking. I was going to say, I know what you're thinking. Nowadays, everybody's parents, both of them work. Yeah, it's probably more of an economic necessity now. It definitely is more now than then. The assumption then is that the dad would make a family wage or a living wage, and then if the mom had a job, it was really just a small supplement. But as the economy gets worse in the 70s, that changes dramatically. And I remember how difficult this was for my parents because my dad always assumed his job was that his income earning power needed to be enough to support the entire family. As the economy changed, that was no longer true. Plus, we lived in Joplin, Missouri, where nobody made any money. So when my mom had to start working, he was incredibly embarrassed by it. And my mom was highly offended that she had to have a job. Now, eventually they didn't really have choices. And my mom ended up kind of liking working, that sort of thing. So, it didn't last that way forever, but they really struggled with the idea that the dad couldn't make enough to be the provider and that the mom might have to work. And she did hold a grudge against him because he didn't make enough money and he felt badly because he didn't make enough money. So it's messy stuff, really messy. But, this era, we just looked at the relationship between husband and wife in a different way. And the economy was different as well. Also, to be fair, we didn't live as expensively as we live now. Every family had a car, but not every driver in every family had a car. We didn't all have to pay, we didn't all have insurance for our car because we drove tanks and stuff. So when they ran into each other, there might be a dent, but you could still drive for another 10 years. Um, Healthcare wasn't as expensive, although catastrophic healthcare is always expensive. We didn't have cell phones. Can you imagine how cheap your life would be without your cell phone and internet access? So there's lots of stuff that we just didn't have that we didn't think was necessary back then. It was easier to live more cheaply. And I'm not going to argue that your cell phone isn't necessary. We all use them all the time. And it's your little computer. Yeah, so I get it. But the feminine mystique was really about women kind of reclaiming who they were, not folding your identity into your family, into your husband, but keeping your own and also maybe expressing your own sexuality. And that comes from, the development of the birth control pill. Super effective method of birth control where you can pretty much decide you can not have a baby. And it works pretty well. I know there are other things you can do, but this is incredibly effective and they didn't have it before, and it gave women control over the situation. So they started taking that, and they started becoming a lot more sexually active. What you'll see as well in the 70s is really an explosion in STDs, which is going to create a new problem, which will come up in the next chapter. All right, Supreme Court, because I got to cover this before we go. Some fairly important cases, a couple of these you've probably heard of. Griswold versus Connecticut. Sorry for the yelling. In the state of Connecticut, which really has those Puritan roots, which we sort of overlook because it was kind of a little colony made from parts of Massachusetts. In Connecticut, it was illegal for women to take birth control pills. It was illegal. And that was whether you were single or married. And the Griswold family, I think it was the family. I know you're thinking those weird movies with Clark Griswold. I think they were married and using birth control, and the police were called, and they went into their houses and confiscated the birth control pills, and they ended up being charged with a crime. This eventually goes to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court says, what? It's like, really? Is that what we're going to do? That's not the official ruling of the Supreme Court. What? Really? But they said that people have a right to privacy in their own home, and especially in their own bedroom. So a state cannot make birth control illegal. Weird to think that we had laws, but they did. And Miranda versus Arizona is really a pretty groundbreaking case. And I think that I'm trying to think, I think this is still like the end of the Earl Warren court. So the Brown versus Board of Education guy. And then I think the 73 is the beginning of the Burger court. So they go from Earl Warren to Warren Burger. So there's two Warrens involved there. Miranda versus Arizona adds to Brady versus Betts, and you're going, of course it does. And it says that, well, it doesn't add to Brady versus Betts. That's going to be a little later, but it says that that if you, let me try again. So Miranda versus Arizona, and what's the other, the one that goes with Brady versus Betts is, the old guy that didn't have a lawyer and then asked for one. He robs a vending machine like in Alabama or something. I can't think of the name of it. So crazy. But Miranda versus Arizona is the one that says they have to read your rights to you when you get arrested. And if they don't, then your arrest may not be valid. The reason that happened, Miranda was this guy's last name, and he was not from the United States. He was from a country where it was more likely that you got the crap beaten out of you until you confessed. So he really didn't want, that isn't what he wanted to do. So he instead just confesses. And sorry, I'm looking at the chat. Okay, yeah, do what you need to do. He confesses and finds out later didn't have to confess. Well, he's guilty of rape, but the only evidence they had was his confession. And so when the confession gets thrown out, plus his lawyer fell asleep during trial from time to time, when his confession gets thrown out, there's no other evidence. So he ends up going free. And then people, of course, are outraged because the rapist went free. But we have the idea that you need to know what your rights are before when you're getting arrested. So the Miranda rights are you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be held against you. And since you all know there's not because you've been arrested, but because of TV, they've actually kind of become a little more lenient about that. The book also talks about the Loving versus Virginia case, where the interracial couple whose marriage was illegal because interracial marriage was illegal in Virginia. The Supreme Court overturns that, and Loving really was their last name, which makes it kind of more fun. I think they made a movie about that, but I just don't watch movies a lot. I wish I could think of that case I was trying to think of. because I don't think your book mentions it, but they should have. I don't know why I can't think of it. I'm going to look it up before we go. Baker versus Carr also establishes that they have to do legislative districts by population, not size. So sometimes they would do, oh dear, sometimes they would do, like the city of Houston would get a representative, but Tom Green County, where I went to college, Angelo State, would get a representative as well. And that might be 10 million people versus 500,000 have the same number of representatives. I'm going to just, I'm looking up that case because it's going to drive me crazy. It's not helpful at all because I can't type either. There we go. So Griswold, Miranda, let's see, Baker versus Carr. Also, let's see what else is mentioned. Oh, Engel versus Vitale is when we decide that public school prayer is no longer valid. And the reason for that is because I promise you that people still pray in school all the time. I would always joke with my students right before a test, students are praying, whether they should pray or not, in a city or in a state. Gideon versus Wainwright. That's the one that says if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be appointed for you. So that happens in the 60s as well. But the Engel versus Vitale case is different. It's New York City schools. And what's going on is they read a sectarian prayer every day, and they have a different kid read the prayer, or they read it out loud over the speaker. And, if you're a Protestant and it's a Catholic prayer, or if you're Buddhist or Muslim and it's a Jewish prayer, that sort of thing. Because the assumption is something that it would be Christian and that it would be a certain sect, or, it'd either be Catholic or Protestant, that kind of thing. And what you'll notice too, if you look at these cases about religious rights, they are often brought by Jehovah's Witnesses who, don't pray in public outside of church, or they don't swear oaths, that sort of thing. So a lot of times the religious freedom cases come from different groups of Christians who don't want other groups of Christians expressing religious belief, because theirs is slightly different. But I would always tell my students, because you've already gathered, I taught in fairly conservative areas that are fairly affluent. A lot of times their parents are those, you took God out of school and everything collapsed after that. And we took God out of school. What we said is that when you're a kindergartner, you don't have to recite a prayer out loud with the rest of the class. They typically read the Lord's Prayer, or as Catholics would say, the Our Father. But if your parents are atheist or agnostic and you didn't know the prayer or something like that, when you're a little kid, this is distressing to you potentially, or it's going to make you go home and question your parents' religious beliefs, which I think is not all bad when you're older, but probably is problematic when you're 5 or 6. So Engel versus Vitale really isn't to eliminate religion, it's to eliminate public school endorsement of particular religions. So, you can still have like your Christian club, your Buddhist club, your Muslim club, your atheist club, all that kind of stuff after school. You can still pray in the cafeteria. You can pray during class. Silently is better. Yeah. I did have a really odd student one time that started reading Bible verses out loud in class. And I said, I don't want to be the first teacher to ever send someone to the office for reading the Bible out loud, but you're about 2 seconds away. And the rest of the class just started laughing. But, he was louder than me. Yeah, and we weren't doing anything that required the reading of Bible verses. He was disrupting class. All right, Roe versus Wade is the big one, the big case of this era. And Roe versus Wade is one of those cases you just have to remember it's kind of up there. It's not the same as Plessy and Brown, but it's, it's one of like the top 10 court cases. And I think Miranda's kind of in there as well. The Roe versus Wade is the case that makes abortion legal in all US states during the first trimester. And it's also set in Texas. And I think Roe was from the Dallas area, and her lawyer, Sarah Weddington, was from the Austin area. And this Norma McCorvey lady, the Roe lady, had already had a child. She was kind of a party girl, had a super rough life. She was pregnant with a second child, really didn't want to have the second child. So she went to Sarah Weddington because she'd heard kind of through the grapevine that she had been able to find an abortion provider. So she really wanted an abortion. What the lawyer convinced her of was to make this a court case. She ends up having the second child. But in certain states, primarily Midwestern and Southern, they banned abortion at any time in the pregnancy. And so you'd have to go to another state, or if you lived in Southern Texas, maybe Mexico, which may or may not be a great idea, kind of dependent. But, or you could find an illegal provider, or you could do what a lot of people did is try to do it yourself, which is going to end poorly as well. So they argued that if you had this right in certain states, you should have it in others, and that, thank you, that your rights might, that this might need to be a protected right. What they decide is that in the first trimester, when the baby is not viable, the first 3 months, that it should be a woman's right to make this choice. Now, later on, they'll add restrictions. They'll say that, government funded healthcare can't pay for this sort of stuff, which means poor women can't get abortions, or people who can't afford them, can't get them paid for by the government. And it's going to lead to all sorts of discussion, conflict, fighting. It's the reason your speech teacher won't allow you to give a speech about abortion. Yeah, so it's important and controversial. And since it's 3-minute warning, I'll probably stop there. Now, before we go, let me double check the roll. So let me